World War Europe went from being very violent to undergoing a kind of a massive cultural change. So from like the 1940s to the 1960s, there was a weird shift away from all kinds of different violence, violence against women, violence against children, all of those things that had been historically for very long periods had been normalized, suddenly were denormalized, and there was this kind of cultural revolution that seemed to in some way be linked to the fact that people kind of got the horror, that they'd actually stepped over the edge of the cliff and they'd seen where it ended, and they decided to step back. And in South Africa, we stepped back kind of before we got over the edge of the cliff. I mean, we had this great negotiated settlement, and that maybe be the problem, is that people never really got that violence is apocalyptically catastrophic, that it's not a resource that we can just keep, on hand all the time and get away with it the way we got away with it in '94. So, yeah, that's pretty much all I can say about that. But it interests me that sometimes there is a massive kind of cultural change as well, and sometimes there isn't. And it seems in South Africa we had the policy change, but not the cultural/identity change. And it would be interesting to do much more work on that. The last question is, what is the objective of the paper? The objective of the paper is to reflect on how we think, and to say that before we go and do research and interventions, we're already carrying a lot of conceptual baggage, and to try and get a lever in there and say, but before we even start reducing violence, let's work out what we actually think about what violence is, why it's a problem, and what the causes are and what the solutions are. And a lot of my work is focusing on that prior moment. So the paper was simply to try and undo a number of assumptions that were already usually there by the time we hit the ground, and then just to introduce one, and not a particularly big theory, just one of, I think, many theories, but one that I think is just adds a little extra thing into the mix, this idea of why people experience victimization and go on to actually positively identify with violence, even though they experienced it as being bad to themselves. They then live as if it's good. It's a kind of overall a good way of conducting oneself in one's social relationships. So that was really where I was trying to go.
Thanks, Anthony. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic questions. I think it's this whole idea of normalization, and I think it was clearly explained the difference. I think it's our biggest challenge is we're trying to understand, and because if we understand violence, and this is where we get confused, right? We think if we understand it means it's normal, right? And I think that's something that's kind of a trap that we've been led into by the media of the day. Your popular psychologist type media, where this is what happened to him, and that's why he's now this serial predator type, and I think that's the challenge that we face, and it's not normal at all. What is interesting about Athens' work is he was very interested in the narrative. He talks about violence, the scripts of violence, and that's where when he did his research, he went to some of the worst prisons in America, and he interviewed hundreds of serious offenders. And he's a qualitative researcher, so he did qualitative interviews, and he identified those scripts of violence, which then became his whole theory. So yes, there is definitely a narrative of violence, and as a parent, I'm also concerned about that, because I can hear my son, and this is that whole thing, and then the knee-jerk reaction is, it's normal for a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old to engage in this type of violence, or this language of violence. It's our role then as parents, and I think that's why it's so important to those sessions later on in the day and tomorrow that deals with parenting. It's our role as parents to contextualize that and to bring that almost moral compass to those type of discussions, that it's not okay to take off your friend's head because he did 1, 2, 3 to you. We have to bring in that, and I think that's an ongoing challenge. And I think we've taken a step back, and I don't want to moralize it, but we've taken a step back as parents in South Africa to a lot of these arguments that's going on, and it's almost like we're waiting for other institutions, government, and to raise our children, schools to raise our children, and it's almost like we don't have a say anymore in the valuing and norming of our children, right? And I think that if we go and do the research, which I think will be very difficult, but if we go and do the research and we look at parents, the role that parents played before and the role that we play as parents today, and how we've backed off on a lot of things over the last few years is going to be very interesting. It's got to be contextualized. Very good question about bystanders work. Yes, the work has been done on the role of bystanders, and both from influencing and perpetuating the violence. We know crowd-based violence. A lot of it is it's not what's happening. It's who's watching it from happening, right? And that if there's an audience, it's normally more escalated and more violent in nature, right? Especially if there's an audience. Okay, so we know that a lot of work has been done on understanding the role of bystanders. But it's an interesting point that you're raising, that if personal horrification is significant in the violentization of this group of young boys that we looked at, then maybe an intervention should be aimed at the bystander and at the other people in the room, and trying to resolve some of these issues. So very good point. Thank you. I'm going to take that and run with it. Okay, so very good idea around personal horrification. Then lastly, very good question. You can see the researchers in the room. Yes, we went physically into both Gugulethu and Khayelitsha towards the end of 2012, beginning 2013. We negotiated with an NGO that's running services in those communities to have access to the 78 young offenders. We physically went there. We trained up our field workers. We used our own students, we trained them, and we only used Xhosa-speaking students, so we back translated, did all the ethical stuff. But we physically had to go into the townships, which brought a very interesting dynamic to the research, of course, because it moves it from being a theoretical type thing that you sit and do in your office to a reality of being and being on the ground, at ground zero, and doing this type of research. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Just firstly to answer the question on, sort of normalization, if I can just sort of give an answer from my perspective. I spend a lot of time on social media, on Twitter, and reading the news, and I think just from my point of view, I would assume all of us here live relatively safe lives. And people like us are not exposed to, sort of deadly violence and deadly assault on a very regular basis. And you sort of see that coming through on social media, where people are constantly horrified by, the things that are happening in the news. So the rape of the children in Ceres, the, Anine Boyce, and that kind of thing. And it is horrifying. But working in the setting that I do, in that trauma unit, where you see horrifying things on an absolutely daily basis, you become quite blunted and, numb is a very emotional word, but, when you see it that often, you become more aware of how in the broader South African society, violence is very normal in a way that isn't so for South Africans who are living a safe and probably well-off life. And this was also highlighted for me recently. I haven't actually worked in the trauma centre for over a year now. I've been working at Red Cross Hospital, where I don't work in the trauma unit. I work in sort of wards upstairs with kids who are just sick. And a couple of months ago, I did a locum at Khayelitsha Hospital in their trauma centre. And obviously, in that time away from trauma, I'd also obviously become resensitized, because it was actually one of the most traumatic nights of my life. The violence was just incredible. And, it sort of brought into contrast for me. Previously when I was working in the trauma centre, I would have worked a night shift like that, gone home, washed my clothes, gone out for breakfast and gone on with my life. Whereas, after a short time of not being exposed to that kind of violence anymore, I really did feel sort of affected by it. Then the second question regarding the staffing, and Prof. Nicol and Prof. Nafsari might want to add to this. We do increase our staffing on the weekends and at predicted busy times. But I think we need to remember that, and we all know this, that the state health sector is chronically under-resourced and understaffed. And my impression while I was working there was that during the week, on sort of a a minimal sort of a staffing level, we could quite comfortably deal with the amount of trauma that we were seeing. And even though we increased our staff and in some sectors even doubled the amount of staff on our weekends, the massive sort of spike is just so huge that even with that increased staffing, we struggle to cope comfortably. And then another issue is that the non-human resources. So you can increase your staffing, but that doesn't mean that you've got more beds, that you've got more ventilators, more theatre time, that kind of thing. And that's also where we really feel the pinch at very busy times. I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that. And then you asked me about, whether or not this data had been made available to the police, and we haven't published this yet. And it's sort of really in its preliminary phases, but that would be interesting as well to know if this would be of any value to the law enforcement agencies.
Great. We've just got another sort of 5 or 6 minutes. Okay, hand right at the back.
Hi, my name is Lucy Malinga from the University of Cape Town in the Transformation Services Office. My question is to Karen. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm looking specifically at your second bullet around specific interventions to help curb the spike. I wanted to know, during the consultation process when you're seeing clients around the interpersonal violence, are there opportunities to educate people around the mental issues that they're dealing with? I understand that they're trying to train, but I'm just thinking about that. But then if not, are we not looking at our university literally right on your doorstep to think about creating posters or images that can help you take that independence to think about these issues you're trying to see them and help with the issues around intervention?
Okay.
My question is quite simple to Leon. It's just about thinking about the research. Do you think that the personal horrification, you're suggesting it might be a linchpin that explains the continuation of violence and violent acts, or the normalisation in certain ways? If that's the case and you studied 78 young offenders, would it be feasible to run the same testing on their siblings or close relations to see if they have similar results? And would that give you a better indication? I was just wondering if you thought about that and if that would be feasible.
Thanks.
My name is SaVI. I'm from Inkanyezi Foundation, which is a grassroots violence prevention initiative. We are based in Pukuletu, Delft, and Khayelitsha. My question is directed to Anthony and Leon and to Karen. I've got 3 questions that I want to ask. The reason why I'm here, I'm looking for solutions. My organization is a grassroots CBO. We are trying to find solutions towards the high level of violence, particularly in the townships and informal settlements. My background, I started becoming interested in this discipline in 2006. Key focal area is church violence, school violence, which is gang related, taxi violence, and family violence. Because there is an interconnection between these types of violence. The people that are in church that resorts to using violence are the very same family members that you find in a family structure. The same family members are also involved in the taxi violence as actually the head of the family. Why we were interested, we wanted to find out why, particularly in our settings, violence is loved. I do agree with Anthony. It is accepted, it is normalized. What is it that we can do to inculcate a new paradigm? Because violence is linked with a cultural settings. I'm gonna make an example with the taxi violence. As I'm working with the taxi guys now, one thing that is becoming clear is the cultural and the identity. AmaXalega, AmaXhosa, AbaThembu. That's what sparks the taxi violence, more than the route invasions. I cannot listen to you because umqaleka. And I was socialized that umqaleka cannot tell umxhosa. So it's an identity crisis. School violence, why? It's an ethnicity division. Kiki, children that come from Kiki, which is a hostel that house people that comes from Transkei, they are just divided by NY1. NY65, when you ask them, what is the bone of contention here? When you ask the police say, Asias, but ask them, you know what a 13-year-old says to me? They say, we are from Eastern Cape. There's an ethnicity inferiority that we are linked with in schools. As a result, the township boys possess an ethnicity superiority. So identity features in. And parents at home are further perpetuating that idea that because you are from Wakiki, I don't know how to translate this term, but it's a term that they usually use. You are a product of an inferior. There is a certain terminology that is aligned to it. It's just that it's gone out of my system now. But already by that, violence becomes normal, because in order for that 13-year-old to defend himself at school, he has to prove to the Kiki boy or to the NY65 boy that I'm not like that. I might be like that, but here, the only weapon that I will use is my black magic that is in my head, that was installed by my parents, because parents take their own children to the Sangomas to make them strong. So I just want to allude to that personal glorification. It's true. But now the biggest challenge that I'm sitting with is, what is it that we can do to promote a new paradigm? To the trauma lady, why the big spike in the interpersonal violence on the weekends? That is what I would like to find out, because township-based violence, mostly Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. We are looking for solutions there as well, because tavern-related or informal liquor outlets-related violence is the biggest challenge. And the weekends are becoming a nightmare. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the set of, in fact, input, rather than, because I think none of us have the solutions, and part of why we're here is about exploring solutions. So I don't think the panel's going to be answering necessarily, but it's an invitation for this conversation to continue over the next 2 days. I think that's part of what we're grappling with. So thank you very much for putting that very firmly on the agenda. There was one more hand. Not. Okay. Can I want to ask 2 questions from the chair, if I may. Anthony, there's this work done by Holston around the concept of violent democracies, that there's this assumption that democracy does not see violence as a norm. But he's done a lot of work in Brazil and Latin America, and South African theorists are beginning to look at it. The notion that violence is part of democracies in some countries, certainly in Latin America, and certainly South Africa falls into that category. And whether you know anything about that, and whether in fact part of what we have in South Africa is a violent democracy. So we're already at 10:02. Can I ask, and I'm aware that I've stuck a whole nother set of questions in, but if we can ask our speakers literally 2 minutes so that we can finish at 5:02 and go for tea, because you need to be back at 11:15. So let's start with you.
Just to answer the question at the back first, whether or not we think there's any way to sort of educate patients when they present. Unfortunately, the setting is just not right. Firstly, the bulk of our patients are extremely intoxicated. I think Prof. Nicol will be presenting a paper on that later today or tomorrow. So they're in no sort of condition to take any kind of advice. And then I often do stitch up patients and say, please go home, go straight home, don't go via the shebeen. But it just seems that violence is so entrenched. You know, we don't have counsellors 24/7 on site. I'm not really in a position to counsel somebody who's lived an entirely different. We don't have many counsellors 24/7 on site.
You got social workers.
Can I interject just
Yeah.
I'm Andrew Nicol,
Yeah.
I run the trauma centre.
Yeah.
You know, I do think there's a point, the trauma at the moment is a teaching point, it's a learning point. And we do feel that it is a time that a certain category of patients will respond to some intervention. And I think it's very important for us to identify those patients that will.
Yeah.
Obviously, yes, alcohol is a major factor in drugs, but we can intervene when they're sober. And that's what we need to start doing. And at the moment, all we're doing is just patching people up. We actually need to intervene. Social workers, I think Kirsten also is going to go into that in some of her presentations later on as well.
The second question is why the big spike on the weekends? Like I say, this study wasn't designed to look at why we have these spikes, but rather just to show that they are there. And once again, I believe, I'm not sure if this reflects the ideas of the rest of the trauma, but we believe that it's substance related, and that that alcohol and other drug use is particularly high on the weekends, and that is a major problem in terms of trauma seen in our unit. And then the last question about our beliefs about our patients. So I think first thing, and I wanted to add this to my talk, but I didn't, I think we have a good understanding that most of our victims are probably perpetrators as well. So for us, there's not a very well-defined line between a victim and a perpetrator. What we have is an injured person, and I think we appreciate that very